The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
Welcome from the General Assembly in the City of Richmond. I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. And a very warm welcome to our guest, the Senate Majority Leader, Tommy Norment. Welcome, sir.
Good morning, Woody. It's very nice to be with you here on a refreshing day in Richmond.
Well, thanks for coming down. We know how busy you are, and we know we are 1 week away from crossover, and that's a very critical date. Talk to us a little bit about what it means.
Gosh, I had forgotten we were that close to it till you told me. Now you've got me trembling over here. For those of who are watching that don't follow the General Assembly that carefully, crossover is like halftime in the Super Bowl. It's where the House of Delegates must finish the work on all of their legislation and send it to the Senate. And the Senate must finish all of its work and send it to the House of Delegates. Hence, we call it crossover because we get each other's legislation. It's normally a frantic couple of days. Like many things in our life, we put off the most important things to the 11th hour, and that's what happens. So it'll be a frantic couple of days, and then we'll come out, and those that deferred until the second half on the coin flip will be getting the legislation, and we will start again. It's almost like starting anew, to be truthful with you.
Well, your colleagues in the House of Delegates suggest that it's when the Senate really begins its work because you get a slew of bills from the members of the House.
Well, it's amazing how prolific those 100 members of the House of Delegates can be. They sometimes, with a number of pieces of legislation they pass, I think they've got some rabbit DNA in them, because they can certainly reproduce those bills incredibly fast-paced.
Well, we know that your district has changed since redistricting, and you represent a very diverse area from the urban center of Hampton to very rural areas. Tell us a little bit about that district.
Well, I'd like to try to put a happy face on it as a result of the Senate Democrats controlling redistricting. They've given me the opportunity to make a lot of new friends, and that's a good thing. I generally like people. They took what was previously a fairly compact senatorial district that I had represented for about 20 years and decided to see just how elastic I was and stretch me out. Right now, the newly configured district runs from just outside of Suffolk, heading down towards North Carolina. It comes up through Smithfield, part of Isle of Wight. One precinct in Surrey that has one registered voter.
One registered voter.
I probably am the only public servant in Virginia that has gotten 100% of a vote in one precinct. That one guy voted for me. I actually called him up on the phone and said, "Hey, do you mind going to the polls and voting for me? I've never carried a precinct with 100%. But then I jump across the James River and come back to my home, James City County. The Democrats did strip the city of Williamsburg out of the district that I represent. And then I sort of move down the peninsula. Somehow they've got me in a couple of precincts in Hampton, which I'm happy to embrace. Then I jump across the York River and pick up my good friends in Gloucester that I've represented for about 20 years. And then I have King and Queen, King William, town of West Point. I mean, there's just lots of very nice people out there I've had a chance to meet. I've learned about the Crab Fest, the Daffodil Festival, a lot of good things.
Yeah, there's a lot of history in the area you represent. I believe Dr. Walter Reed was born in part of your district. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, as we were talking just before we came on air, I couldn't remember exactly the area of Gloucester where Dr. Walter Reed was born, but I did remember, and I think it's called Belroy, is where it is. And actually, as you're going down Route 17, which is the main artery that runs through the length of Gloucester, there's a historical marker right there near Belroy that marks the birthplace of Walter Reed, and of course the hospital facility that was located over in Gloucester was named after Walter Reed. But there's a lot of history in that area. We frequently refer to Williamsburg, Jamestown, and Yorktown as America's historic triangle. But we really forget that there are some very significant historical sites scattered all around that part of Virginia. Actually, some archaeologists think that they have discovered one of the original villages of Powhatan that we've all heard about in Virginia's history, the father of Pocahontas, as she was known by other names, or Rebecca. But that's over in Gloucester, and is on a plantation site that actually a friend of mine owns, who's trying to preserve that. So there's just a lot of different spots that are around. You get up in King William and King and Queen. The Native Americans had many tribal sites that were located in those areas. You may recall a few years ago there was a sort of a disagreement going on between the city of Newport News and King William County over building a reservoir in King William County. And one of the main objections that King William had, in addition to the flooding that was going to take place, was the flooding or the trespassing, if you will, on some fairly sacred Native American land. So it's an area that is rich with America's history, and it's not all just in Williamsburg and Jamestown and Yorktown.
Must be tough losing Williamsburg. There was a ceremonial session of the General Assembly there, I believe, last week or week before.
It was actually 2 weekends ago. We had a commemorative session. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation has been very generous for many years. I think this was the 25th commemorative session that Colonial Williamsburg has sponsored. What the foundation does is that they have a commemorative session in the 18th century Capitol there on the Duke of Gloucester Street. They usually bring in a renowned speaker to address a joint session of the General Assembly. This year it was the renowned Bud Roberson, who was a professor, retired professor as he advised us, from Virginia Tech. He is one of the country's renowned scholars on the Civil War and has written the definitive book on a gentleman who is very legendary at my alma mater, VMI, Thomas Stonewall Jackson. And Bud Roberson delivered the remarks this year, and he was absolutely captivating. He did a marvelous job of blending historical facts with humor. But this has been a tradition that the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation has done for many years on the year immediately following the election, where the entire General Assembly stands for re-election. So they were wonderful hosts. We had that commemorative session. They took the legislators on tours of Colonial Williamsburg. And then that evening they hosted a reception and a dinner where they just had a marvelous presentation. It was sort of a multimedia presentation with the drum and fife corps, but also with video clips and slide and a narration. Really quite impressive.
And part of his message, as I understand it, as was part of Governor McDonnell's message when he gave the State of the Commonwealth, was one of comity, the necessity for Republicans and Democrats to get along, especially in this 2012 session.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about the word comedy, collegiality. We can use a lot of descriptive adjectives. I mean, you have been observing the General Assembly for a number of years. There's always a little unrest following an election cycle. There's an especially escalated level of unrest where you have a change in the balance of power, and I use that term only descriptive and not to be disingenuous to anyone whatsoever. It was a particularly tense start to the 2012 session in the Senate. We have 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats. There was some discussion about who was going to be managing the flow of legislation, who was going to control the committees, with the Lieutenant Governor, Bill Bowling, being a Republican and having the ability to cast a tie-breaking vote in many instances. My Republican colleagues and myself took the position that as long as we had the Lieutenant Governor to cast the 21st vote, then we needed to be deciding what the composition of committees would be. There were some disappointments with my Democratic friends, and I mean that sincerely. I understand their disappointment. It's very difficult sometimes when you've been in office, say, for 20 years and worked very hard to get to a chairmanship of a committee, or you find yourself in a position of influence, and as a result of the vagaries of an election, you wake up and find that you no longer are a chairman of a committee, you no longer can control the destiny. And it's just human nature that you experience a certain disappointment. I think you try to be gracious about it, but nagging in the back of your mind is, gosh, this is where I find myself after 20 years. So we've had some tensions, and I've tried very hard to not be confrontational with my Democratic friends, even though there have been some instances where they have tried to put a teaser out there. I think it's best to try to work collegiately as best as we can. Of course, as I've told you before, probably only 5% of the legislation that we ever deal with in the General Assembly has a partisan bite to it. 95% of what we do here in the General Assembly is driven either by an ideology or a parochial concern, meaning we have a certain conscience about an issue, or we have that stewardship responsibility to look out for the best interest of those voters that sent us here. And consequently, you get some parochial votes that come along that don't follow party lines. They just follow urban against rural, that type of thing.
Now, you've been affiliated with issues around higher education for most of your career. You're very close to William and Mary. Governor McDonnell signaled you out in his State of the Union address in terms of getting more Virginia residents admitted to our institutions of higher learning. I know that's a big issue for you and your constituents. Tell us a little bit more about what's going on in higher education.
Well, thank you, Woody. I've been a shameless advocate of higher education in Virginia for many, many years. I did my undergraduate work at VMI, and I like to say in my right arm, I bleed red, white, and gold, and then my left arm, I bleed green and gold because I got my law degree from the College of William and Mary and grew up in that community. I led the effort a number of years ago in the restructuring of higher education, and it was a very controversial restructuring. What we attempted to do was to try to give our major colleges and universities the opportunity to have greater freedom in the management of their universities. But in exchange for that latitude, we insisted that they meet certain performance measures. And this was a hallmark piece of legislation that actually has drawn national attention because of the success on it. We've been through several additional versions of it. The governor had indicated that he wanted to try to have 100,000 new degrees granted to Virginians in the next 15 years. That led to the Higher Ed Restructuring Act that we did in 2011 and has led to some legislation this year. I've been very proud to be on the forefront of each of those three pieces of legislation. And part of it is just by living in a college community through osmosis, you learn something. But for the last 4 years, I've had the privilege of teaching at the William and Mary Law School and also in the government department to the undergraduates. And once you become actively involved in academia, such as it is, you gain a whole different perspective. While I know many college professors, to have them as colleagues and see them when I'm teaching, to have that accessibility just when you're walking through the halls and somebody goes, "Hey, Tommy, let me share this with you about higher education." That proximity and that immersion in itself gives you, I think, a more enlightened perspective. So I'm very hopeful that we'll continue to be a national benchmark for improving higher education. There are two things that I remain very persistent in my pursuit. One is affordability. It is not the young people that are coming from affluent or poor families that are challenged in the higher education expenses, because the more affluent families have the family wealth or resources to take care of it. If you're of a lower income, there are many, many opportunities out there for grants and scholarships. And it's more of the middle class that is really getting squeezed because they don't have the fiscal affluence, and they might not have the access to some of the financial services that are available. So we're working on the affordability issue. You've heard the governor suggesting in very strong terms that we need to hold the cost of tuition and fees down. We're looking at legislation right now that would require higher education institutions to increase their financial assistance package. In other words, to grow that pot of money that would be available to assist students. The first class of every semester when I teach, I ask the students, how many of you all have student debt? How many of you are working? And particularly in the law school, where there's a very rigorous and intense academic curriculum that they're following, and they're very serious students. It amazes me. I would say 85% of the students in my law classes have some form of financial assistance, and an equal percentage of them are actually working. And when I say working, I'm not talking about doing research necessarily for a professor. I'm talking working a retail job, working as a server, whatever it takes. So we need to provide the affordability. Another thing is accessibility. And one of the wonderful things that we did in the first higher ed restructuring bill was what we call articulation agreements. And what that articulation agreement is, that we assured community college students that if they maintained an appropriate academic average, that they could get into our flagship universities, that our major colleges and universities would have to accept transfer students from the community college system. And fortunately, all of our major institutions have stepped forward and are accepting these transfers from the community college system. That's particularly important because more and more students are going to community colleges in this day and age because of the affordability of it. It's less expensive because they're non-residential, with the exception of John Tyler Community College. They're less expensive, but it also gives the students the flexibility to maintain a course load, but also to maintain a job if that's what it takes. So we're working on accessibility and affordability, and we'll continue to focus on that.
And those community colleges play a very important role in terms of workforce development, the need to develop a workforce for the future, focused on a lot of technical related matters in different fields now.
Oh, absolutely. The community college system is so important. We were talking about Gloucester a little earlier. Right over there, in the Gloucester area, we have a community college system over there, which is serving the Middle Peninsula and some of the students from the Northern Neck area. Vitally important on it. We have Thomas Nelson Community College, which has their main campus in Hampton and has what they call the Northern Campus in James City County. I used to represent the Eastern Shore for 10 years. The only higher educational institution in Virginia on the Eastern Shore is Eastern Shore Community College. So we've got a wonderful system of community colleges, and for that we should be very prayerful of former Governor Mills Godwin, who envisioned this when he was governor and created that. But they do a lot of things. The workforce transition. In Newport News, Canon has a very significant presence there with a plant. Several years ago, they did a worldwide competition within the Canon family. One plant in the world was going to get to expand and expand significantly. As a result of that competition, the Canon plant in Newport News was selected to do that expansion, which ultimately may be a $1 billion expansion. And it's going to increase the workforce as much as 2,500 people. But the key element, a key element to that was Thomas Nelson Community College agreeing to work with Canon to do a workforce training facility to train those new workers that would have the skill set to do what the manufacturing requirements were of Canon. Critical. We could not have done it without the community college system.
And so this is another example of how jobs can be created in the Commonwealth and in turn improve our economy.
Absolutely. And the community college system does an extraordinary job of that, just extraordinary. And I think we have to be very mindful. everybody's at the competing for dollars. Not you, you're independently wealthy, so you don't worry about it. But in the higher education community, a lot of competition for the dollars that are being appropriated by the General Assembly. I think we need to increase the appropriations to community colleges because they are the gateway for so many people to their continuing education.
Sticking on our education theme, there's a lot of examination of what's going on in K through 12. Not only funding, but an examination of teacher contracts. Sort of the same concept that exists in higher education, tenure. What's going on there?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about K through 12, and I'm a participant in that discussion, and frankly, there's a significant burden on my shoulders because I'm chairing the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Education. I know a lot about higher education. I'm still in the learning stages of K through 12 public education and working very hard to get a grasp on that. Governor McDonnell proposed some educational reform issues. One of them was the doing away with what they call the continuing contract, or what you and I refer to as tenure. And it's not without controversy. Obviously, the Virginia Education Association, advocating on behalf of teachers, would not want to end continuing contracts. The VEA has opposed merit pay and merit-based advancement for a number of years because their job is to protect all of the teachers. I have mixed emotions on it, and part of my mixed emotions is that a lot of times when you are in the legislature, it's very easy to vote yes or no on an issue. But if all of a sudden, and you've heard me say this before, you put a face on that vote and it becomes personal to you, it gets much more difficult for you to cast that vote. My wife was a former public school teacher. Both my children and my wife and I were products of Virginia's public education system, and currently my oldest daughter, Casey, is a public school teacher in Williamsburg, James City County system. So I have a face on it, and when I go home and perhaps have not done exactly what my daughter would like, she has a little bit of her dad's DNA, and she will speak to me about, why did you do this, Dad? Are you really cutting funding to public education? Are you going to try to eliminate these support staff members to education? What are you doing about retirement? And that's a good thing, because as a legislator, it's not that you're indifferent. There's just an awful lot going on. The velocity of things swirling around you is enormous, and you just need somebody to say, hey, stop and think about this a minute, and that's a good thing. But the tenured contract, the governor's pretty insistent about this. He's been working to develop comity and consensus. It's my understanding that the state superintendents have now come out and have embraced sort of transitional concept of eliminating tenure. Maybe that they'll go to, rather than a one-year contract, perhaps a 3-year contract. It's still evolving through the legislative process. So we'll see how that comes out. I happen to be a performance-based guy, but that's just me. I've been an attorney for well over 30 years, and nobody gives me a continuing contract. Whether I flourish or whether I flounder in the business is based upon my performance. It's not based upon a contractual relationship. If I perform well, then my business flourishes. If I perform poorly, then I flounder.
Same thing with your seat here in the General Assembly.
Boy, I've done a lot of floundering over the years, I can tell you that, my friend. Sometimes I feel like I belong in the Chesapeake Bay, that I'm floundering around so much. And
We'll talk about eliminating things. There's an attempt to eliminate the King's Dominion law. There's a need to balance jobs there against the ability of local school districts to control their destiny, so to speak.
Well, I have enormous affection for Governor McDonnell. I mean, he's like my brother, but he and I are having a parting of the ways on that issue. The governor announced that he, as part of his educational reform package, that he wanted to do away with the Labor Day bill. And I have challenged him on that. I made it very clear to him in the first week that he could not count on my support on that, and in fact I would work very arduously to see that bill was defeated. So we have an understanding on that, and you don't always agree on every issue. I mentioned to you earlier that 95% of the votes that are cast in the General Assembly are either based on ideology or parochialism. This is a bill to me that fits in both those categories. The ideology is many people in Virginia do not realize that tourism is between a 17 and 19 billion dollar industry every year.
17 to 19 billion
every year. And much of those tourist dollars come right around the extended holiday weekends like Memorial Day and Labor Day. You would be shocked. Some localities get as much as 22% of their annual revenue in that extended weekend around Labor Day. So it is very significant economic driver. And I've heard arguments, well, doing away with the Labor Day bill that precludes some of the schools from opening before Labor Day, it's not going to have any impact. It is going to have some impact. And I'll just give you a parochial, for instance. About a 9-iron shot from my front porch is a little place called Busch Gardens. Just down the street from Busch Gardens is another entertainment facility known as Water Country USA. 2 miles to the left is Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Busch Gardens alone employs over 1,000 students. 1,000 students. And these students aren't what we call J1s. The days are gone where they bring them in from India or Thailand or Eastern Europe. Because of the recession, there is such a competitiveness for getting jobs right now that they are able to fill that primarily from local young people and local retirees. And 1,000 students is very, very significant. And if all of a sudden we lost that workforce because of a pre-Labor Day opening, the economic impact would be enormous to Busch Gardens, enormous, and how they would fill that. I don't know that there are that many retirees that they could backfill those positions with, and that's just one instance. You've got lots of other venues. You hear King's Dominion. How about Virginia Beach? Labor Day's huge in Virginia Beach, huge, and they have everything from concessionaires to lifeguards to seasonal police. It just has a lot of ramifications, so it's not quite as whimsical as it may seem. And we are a commonwealth, and sometimes those that perhaps live in areas that are not tourist-oriented, as part of the greater commonwealth, they need to be sensitive to the other part of the commonwealth that may rely very heavily on tourism. And there is a concentration east of 64.
Great. Well, good luck in that endeavor. Good luck with the rest of the 2012 session. I know the budget is a big issue. I wish we had time to discuss that as well. But thank you for being here again, Senator Tommy Norment, the Senate Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Woody. It's nice to be with you as always.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.